a very warm welcome to our third keynote talk slot. Brilliant to see so many people here already, and I think we're in for a really exciting time. And it's wonderful that Professor Becky Francis can join us today and to share her wisdom that covers many areas that are vital to education, of course, including research, but also the intersections with policy and with practice. Becky is the Chief Executive Officer of the Education Endowment Foundation, and the EEF, of course, is increasingly important in matters of effectiveness, of ways of doing research, of making sure that research is accessible to teachers, practitioners, and to policymakers. Becky was previously director at the UCL Institute of Education, where I had the pleasure of working closely with her, but she's had other important roles, including at King's College London, also the Director of Education at the RSA. She's a standing advisor to the Parliamentary Education Select Committee, and she was the inaugural Yidden Global Fellow at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Becky's work is so important in terms of social identities and educational attainment, particularly including gender, race, and social class. And I also very much enjoyed learning more about the work that she did, for example, on grouping in secondary schools in particular. It was a topic that I'd encountered many years ago, and it really sort of excited me and motivated me again. And it made me think, well, why do certain things happen in schools, well, and early years settings through custom and practice? And what is the relationship with research? And why, in fact, does research that shows a clear direction not always get picked up in policy and practice? These are the areas I think that Becky has so much to share with us. So without further ado, I'm not in rainy London as I was yesterday. I'm in sunnier just outside Cambridge. All of this doesn't matter, of course, because it's digital. But I'm going to hand over to Becky. Thank you, Becky. We look forward to hearing you talk.
Thanks so much for the warm welcome, Dom. And it's a real privilege to be presenting to BERA today. Now, of course, I don't think I need to convince anyone in this audience of the importance of educational research. And as we know, education research is important for many ends, from better understanding cognitive processes of learning to improving the practice and experience of education. But educational inequality remains a challenge to social justice in the UK and across the world. And education research has an important role to play in addressing this. And that's the focus of my talk today. And the point that I wish to labour is the urgency of research impact in relation to this issue. Now, there's been strong recognition of the impact of the COVID pandemic in exacerbating social inequalities, including educational inequality. The COVID crisis has shone a light on existing inequalities that have been illustrated over the period, including issues of access to education and ed tech, the reliance on schools for wider social services such as meals provision, and so on. But the gap, of course, has been long-standing. In the UK context, family wealth is the strongest predictor of educational attainment. Sociologists have often seen education as a tool for reproducing inequalities rather than a tool for social mobility, as it's often positioned. Of course, it can be both. But certainly sociologists and economists agree that at present social mobility is low and that education both reflects and replicates inequalities, as the comparatively low rates of access by pupils from poor backgrounds to our selective universities illustrates. So in this talk, I'm going to touch on the range of explanations for the socio-economic gap in educational achievement and what might be done to alleviate them. I'll argue for the need for and benefits of rigorous empirical research that's focused on identifying solutions as well as identifying problems to help ensure that education mitigates inequalities rather than exacerbating them. So just focusing in then on educational inequality. Education is one of the strongest predictors of life chances. Especially attainment at GCSE maths and English is a key predictor of later outcomes and to accessing jobs and further routes in education. Impetus's recent briefing on the impact of maths and English compared a group of young people who passed maths and English GCSE with a group that didn't, and found that having GCSEs in English and maths is correlated to lower NEET rates, higher access to university, higher access to the most selective universities, higher pass rate among those that start a degree, and so on. And we know the impacts on employment too. But this slide illustrates some key points. While more than 2/3 of non-disadvantaged children achieved grade 4 or higher in maths and English, just 36% of those eligible for free school meals did so. That's illustrated in the top bullet on the right-hand side. The other bullets illustrate the depth of the problem. And the final bullet point draws on research from Ruth Lupton and her colleagues, really highlighting that this isn't just about academic routes. Apprenticeships often require a grade 4 and above at maths and English GCSE to progress down those routes as well. So you can see that for this significant group of free school meals pupils not achieving this outcome, their life chances are being curtailed at a very early age. On the left-hand side of the slide, this infographic really illustrates two key points. First of all, that the gap is significant when children arrive at school. So this isn't just about schooling, it's obviously about relative affluence and poverty in family situations outside school. So kids arrive with that gap. But nevertheless, the gap grows as kids move through their schooling journey, with the gap growing particularly as they move through secondary schooling. And obviously I'm focusing on social background, but it's really important to recognise the importance of intersectionality here. This slide illustrates the trend for attainment according to ethnicity, with the column for the white majority pupils in the middle right of your screen, and the two comparatively small pupil groups of Chinese heritage and Gypsy Roma children at either end of the spectrum, so illustrating the trend there. And this next slide focuses on reading, which I've chosen as an area where gender differentials are especially strong. And the slide illustrates both the general strength of social background as a predictor of outcomes, but also the importance of intersectional nuance. So in terms of reading this slide, I hope you can see clearly here, the pale columns represent girls, the darker columns boys. And in each case, the darker column of the two is kids on free school meals. So the darkest column is boys on free school meals. And then each clump of columns represents a different ethnic group. And we can see the gender trend here across the board for reading. But for the white British majority and Indian heritage pupils, boys not on free school meals continue to outperform girls on free school meals, even in this very gendered area. So social background trumping gender again here. But that wasn't the case for Black Caribbean heritage pupils, illustrating the importance of a focus on which pupils and that forensic intersectional approach. And this slide, it makes that point again, looking at gender and free school meals with this key GCSE outcome indicator at stake. So again, we can see that for both non-free school meals and free school meals kids, gender making a difference of about 8 percentage points. Again, that's very indicative of the last 30 years, actually. But if we look within those groups of girls and boys, we can see the difference between those taking free school meals and those not, of over 30 percentage points in each case, so absolutely dwarfing the gender gap. And even in the case of non-free school meals boys, they outperform girls on free school meals by around 24 percentage points. And this slide from Clifton and Cook is one that I like to use just to show that this isn't simply about poverty as indicated by free school meals. This slide illustrates nicely the very tight correlation between social background, levels of deprivation versus affluence, and that very tight relationship there. John Jerram showing that family wealth being the strongest predictor of educational outcomes in the UK case. But it's also important to mention that this is not simply a UK phenomenon. The social disadvantage gap for attainment is significant across OECD countries. And the UK actually does better than many other countries in terms of social mobility. For example, 41% of 25 to 34-year-olds in the UK have attained a higher level of education than their parents, compared to an OECD average of 37%. It's also one of a relatively small number of countries, mainly characterised by Scandinavian countries and Canada, aside from the UK, that maintain the large majority of pupils studying a comprehensive curriculum right through to age 16. So I think being mindful of some of those positives and recognising that is also really important. Now, thinking about the impact of COVID here, education systems have differed in their ability to support remote learning, and in the UK, relatively little was provided previously online. But schools have been providing substantial support to enable remote learning and have responded incredibly quickly, as we know. But surveys of teachers and parents in England from the Sutton Trust, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, NFER and others show that children from the most disadvantaged families were spending less time on learning activities, were submitting less work, and typically had less access to resources at home during the periods of lockdown. So although obviously efforts to support remote learning have been of considerable benefit to many children, there are indications that the gap has widened over the period. The EEF's Rapid Evidence Review in 2020 showed the consistently negative impact of school closures on general learning, and particularly on the learning of socially disadvantaged kids. And many interim findings on the widening gap have now been published. This slide shows the EEF web pages where we are collating the different studies here and their results and digesting those as a resource for people to access. And sure enough, GCSE results have confirmed these predictions. The gap between free school meals pupils and their peers has widened by 0.12 of a grade since 2019. And while looking solely at grade 7 and above, the gap has widened by 2.3 percentage points over the last 2 years rather. And I'll just let you have a look at the detail on that slide there. So this slide summarises the findings after 3 periods of lockdown and school disruption. Some localities have been hit harder than others. Indicative findings are showing that the Northeast, Northwest and Midlands have been hit particularly hardest, as we might imagine, given the prevalence of the pandemic and infection rates. Obviously, some pupil groups have been hit harder, as I've been saying, with that widening gap for social disadvantage. There does seem some indication of some progress made in the autumn term, but that then the gap has widened subsequently again in the subsequent period of disruption. You can see the impacts there in the next bullet. And although all groups saw increases in outcomes at GCSE and A-level, given some of the inflation there, it was students from non-disadvantaged backgrounds that saw significantly larger increases in those outcomes. So the next section focuses on what explains the gap. And sociologists, of course, drawing on Bourdieu, tend to talk about different types of capital as explaining the gap for social background. So financial capital clearly making a difference in relation to the resources parents have to spend on, for example, educational experiences, educational toys and learning resources from the earliest age, and then purchasing power in relation to, for example, being able to afford to buy a house in the catchment of a great school, to pay for extra provisions such as tutoring or private schooling and so forth. Social capital refers to the networks that middle-class parents are able to draw on in terms of information, experiences, perhaps work experience placements, internships and so forth, that those in their network can provide. And the cultural capital in this case really refers to that understanding of the rules of the game from high-level educational experience in middle-class families, knowing how the system works, knowing where the best schools and resources are and how to access them, being able to advocate effectively for your child, and so on. And then, of course, in addition to these factors of social background, there are practices of schooling, both issues for the school system and within schools. And I'll come to those next. And what I'm trying to do here in each case is sort of to drill down a layer of the explanations in each case. So having talked about unequal starting points, we then have different issues around school provision and practice. First of all, unequal access to quality provision, and there are issues in relation to modes of access and modes of admission, which has been a strong area of research. I'll come back to the issue and drill further into the question about quality provision in a second. Then we have social segregation resulting from inequality in institutional access and from within school segregation. Ongoing stereotyping and low expectations for pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds, whether via overt stereotyping, impoverished provision, or it could be labeling and so forth. Next, we have ongoing inequality of capitals with a cumulative impact, of course, as pupils move through the school system, often meaning that disadvantaged learners are less able to access educationally enriching experiences, trips, music lessons, work experience placements, and so on. There is lower level of advantageous parental engagement in relation to education, that information, practical support, and so on. Less advice on appropriate curriculum subject choice and those later choices about university, career pathway, different qualifications, and so on too. And perhaps not surprisingly, given what I've said, there are issues about potential disengagement for kids from socially disadvantaged backgrounds as well. So drilling in then, as I've said, to the issues about quality provision. Socially disadvantaged kids are overrepresented in poorer quality schools. They're underrepresented also at high attaining schools. Now you'll notice how I'm differentiating between quality and attainment here, because of course some of our most high attaining schools may be selective or partially selective, but nevertheless disadvantaged kids underrepresented at both. Less access to experienced or subject specialist teachers. Now, we know that teaching quality is shown to be the most important element supporting pupil progress in school. And Ainscough and colleagues have shown that that's particularly true for socially disadvantaged kids. But pupils in schools serving areas of higher deprivation are much more likely to have teachers without an academic degree in a relevant subject, according to findings from Becky Allen and her colleagues. Luke Sibietta's 2018 report for EPI found that at Key Stage 4, only 37% of maths teachers and 45% of chemistry teachers in deprived schools outside London have a relevant degree, while only 17% of physics teachers have a relevant degree in deprived schools outside London. And going back to my bullets, disadvantaged learners are less likely to pursue subjects that enable progression routes to high status careers. Again, it's important to recognise that actually the Progress 8 measure and EBAC measures seek to incentivise that comprehensive provision in this regard and to mitigate that impact. And disadvantaged learners are less likely to be able to access quality support and relevant experiences outside school, as I've said. And then disadvantaged learners are also concentrated in low sets and streams. And here I want to, again, drill in further. Again, I'm drilling in further to each of these explanatory factors to illustrate both the importance of research, but also how gaps in the literature can impede practice. So it's a long-standing point of evidence that socially disadvantaged pupils are overrepresented in lower streams and sets. And if you think about that earlier infographic about the gap with which young people arrive in school, of course, if we're applying attainment grouping, that's not surprising to see that disproportionate representation in low sets and streams. But the really key issue here is that research consistently shows that pupils in those low sets and streams make poorer progress and have poorer outcomes, leading to myself and my research team arguing that these pupils are facing a double disadvantage. Now, I just want to pause for a second to make some remarks about terminology here. Setting and streaming are facets of what in the US and in parts of Europe are commonly referred to as tracking, and what we refer to as attainment grouping or differentiating by attainment. Tracking can refer to practices as diverse as subject level setting to kids attending different schools based on vocational or academic routes. So there is huge complexity at stake here, and often a lot of overgeneralization about what we mean when we're talking about tracking, or indeed about any of these different practices of attainment grouping. Streaming refers to pupils moving along the attending different curriculum subject areas, generally with the same group of peers, based on some common notion of their prior attainment or, inverted commas, ability, as it's often couched. So you'd expect to be in the same group for both maths and English, for example. Whereas setting is more nuanced and subject level. So you might be in a top set for maths, but a bottom set for English, for example. In practice, many schools combine elements of both approaches, which complexifies things even further. Now, this is the conclusion from the EEF's synthesis of the research literature in this case. And I'll just leave you to read this slide. So this is, as I've said, a very well-researched area. There's a huge body of academic literature globally on this topic, and extending over a very long period as well. And there have been various explanations for poor outcomes in low attainment groups, although interestingly, as myself and my research team have pointed out, often these different explanations haven't been well disaggregated or assessed in terms of the relevant, the relative extent of their impact on these outcomes. But I'll just whiz through them very quickly. So there's teacher expectations and related pedagogy that seem to be different depending whether addressing a high attainment group or a low one. And findings of direction of impoverished curricula and qualification tiering for those in low sets and streams. Many of you are aware that certain exam paths are capped, so it's impossible for you to go beyond a particular grade if you're entered for an exam in that way. There are issues about the quality of teaching, with suggestions that subject experts or most experienced teachers tend to be directed to higher attainment groups, and the reverse being the case for low attainment groups. There's long-standing findings about misallocation to attainment groups, with some studies, I think I'm right to say, including the research by Mireille Dunn and her colleagues, showing actually a tighter correlation between social background and set allocation than with prior attainment and set allocation. That point about allocation has a particular bearing because there's also long-standing findings about lack of fluidity once kids are placed in particular attainment groups. Often, despite best intentions, kids tend to stay in the one that they're originally allocated to, irrespective of their then following attainment. Again, perhaps not surprisingly, given what I've said, there's suggestion of impact of labelling on student engagement and attitude. So being labelled a high attainer or a low attainer has impacts for then engagement and motivation. And all of these factors potentially working together to create a self-fulfilling prophecy for kids in high or low attainment groups. But there are some significant questions still remaining from this enormous body of research. We don't know what the impact is on achievement for students in low sets and streams if detrimental practices are mitigated. So, for example, what might the effect be if we put the best teachers or the most experienced teachers with low attainment groups? Or does the labelling associated with attainment grouping trump these elements of practice? Secondly, what actually constitutes good practice in mixed attainment teaching and grouping? There's incredibly little research on mixed attainment teaching in comparison to the level of attention to attainment grouping. But of course, if we want change or experimentation, we have to be responsible because we don't want to see greater harms. We need to make sure that mixed attainment or other approaches are effective. And then, of course, the third question, which of these good practice alternatives is actually more effective in improving the attainment of low attaining students? And I'm glad to say that some of my colleagues from my prior research team, now led by Jeremy Hodgson and Becky Taylor, are moving forward on a project to explore that last issue. Our own study looked at the two former questions. I don't want to get into the methods here. It's a very complex, wide-ranging and large-scale study using a mixed methods approach, including two RCTs. If you want to find out more, the methodology is fully elaborated in our book, which you can see in the top right-hand corner here, or indeed in our many journal articles on this. Really, I'm using this as a case within this keynote talk. But it's important to mention that the fully powered RCT was focused on best practice in setting. As you can see, that involved 126 secondary schools. And that was evaluated by the NFER and found no effect. You can look at this on the Education Endowment Foundation website if you're interested. What we don't know again is that whether this reflects the lack of fidelity, with schools finding it very difficult to implement practices that mitigate harms in setting, or whether actually simply labelling involved in setting trumps these practice elements. So again, further research required. And the mainstay of the research team are captured in that last bullet point. There have been a few others that have moved in and out over the 3-year period of the project, but most represented here. So going on to some quick bullet sort of findings now, I'm going to again whiz through, focusing first on the question of misallocation. We looked here at the control group schools as indicating kind of business as usual practice, and found that in relation to prior attainment indicated by Key Stage 2 outcomes, about a third of pupils were misallocated to sets in practice. And we didn't find a trend of misallocation according to social background. As you'd imagine, bearing in mind what I've said, socially disadvantaged pupils were over-concentrated in low attainment groups in the control group. Again, I guess, reflecting their prior attainment, but not reflecting misallocation. But we did see trends of misallocation according to other variables. Very disturbingly, Black students were 2.5 times more likely than white students to be misallocated down a set in maths. Asian students over 1.5 times more likely than white students to be misallocated down a set, and girls 1.5 times more likely than boys to be misallocated down a set in maths. In terms of the reverse trends, misallocation to higher sets, again, we see those patterns in reverse, with white students more likely than Black and Asian students to be misallocated up a set in maths, and boys more likely than girls to be misallocated up a set in maths. And it won't surprise you to hear that we also ran this analysis for English and found similar patterns, but in the case of gender, a reversal, with girls more likely to be misallocated up a set in English and boys more likely to be misallocated down a set. If you're interested in this article, it was led by Paul Connolly and published in Burge. Then we have findings on teaching quality. We found some evidence of allocation bias, with teachers more highly qualified in their taught subject less likely to be allocated to low sets. And there was actually some evidence of mitigation of that pattern for the intervention schools, where we'd asked for sort of fair practices of allocation. So that's quite encouraging, and an indication that these trends may be disrupted. Pupil views were very interesting here. They perceived teachers of high sets to have rigorous expectations of discipline, to push pupils, and also to show respect for their pupils. This was often seen to be reflected in what kids characterized as strict approaches that were seen by pupils to reflect high expectations and care for students and their outcomes. By contrast, the pedagogy for low sets was often perceived by kids to be more tolerant and relaxed, spoon feeding and kind of dumbed down and slow paced. And actually this was resented, and there was concern by young people in regard to this, because they felt that high expectations and a stricter approach actually set them up better and drove them forward. So again, that issue about strictness suggesting and high expectations indicating respect came through strongly. In terms of self-confidence, now the benefit of this being a 2-year intervention lent a longitudinal element to the analysis. And this slide shows trends in self-confidence over 2 years, comparing students in top and bottom sets respectively with those in the middle set. And you can see that for both subject level self-confidence in English and maths respectively, and for then general self-confidence in learning, we can see a trend here, statistically significant for high sets, where that self-confidence has grown comparatively over the 2-year period, and for low sets, the reverse being true, particularly in the case of maths. For English, it's greyed out because the trend is not statistically significant. Likewise, similar results for attainment. This slide shows post-mean gains in attainment by set level, controlling for prior attainment and a range of other factors. And again, we can see that over the 2-year period, the progress for the top set comparatively and for the bottom set progressing at a reduced rate over the 2-year period. And that is particularly true, interestingly, in English. The difference for maths was less significant. So to quickly summarize what we can say about attainment grouping, we've seen how it creates social segregation, with social background being disproportionately represented in different attainment groups, and compounded by certain pupil groups being more likely to be misallocated. We can see the impact of attainment grouping on subject and general self-confidence, which widens over time according to sets. And we can see the same for attainment outcomes, with, again, high set students advantaged. We've seen that the quality of provision often differs between sets. And a key finding from our project was how and why schools find it hard to improve equity in setting. Often this was due to quite practical logistical challenges and issues such as timetabling and so forth, as well as wider cultural challenges and norms. And as I've said, there's still not enough evidence about alternatives, including mixed attainment grouping. So if we want practice to change and to move to more equitable practice, we need to be able to provide evidence on alternatives. More evidence on effective practice in mixed attainment grouping, and of course resources, and to be able to to support busy teachers with their practice, and indeed to be able to answer some of the other key outstanding questions that I've mentioned. Our research team had a little go at providing some practical resources, and you can Google this if you're interested, the do's and don'ts of attainment grouping, where we tried to pick out evidence-led messages about mitigating harms with setting and supporting a good practice in mixed attainment grouping. And I suppose that moves me on nicely to the next section of my talk, which is focused on engagement. Now, having been on the REF subpanel for education in 2014 and assessed the education disciplines first batch of impact case studies, I've no doubt that education will have returned a similarly strong set of submissions to the 2021 REF. Nevertheless, I hope that the earlier part of my talk has highlighted the urgency to go further and faster, an agenda that I'm also driving at the Education Endowment Foundation. So how to encourage traction? Well, recently a whole field of publication and debate has grown up around knowledge brokerage and influencing policy, and I'm often invited to talk on that. So I hope it's useful to share a few thoughts here. I'd say that in order to make an impact, research needs to be constructive and to engage with practice and policy. Now, a common response from researchers to those points is that policymaking is political and policymakers select which research they apply according to political ends. And clearly there's an element of that. And in my view, education will always inevitably be somewhat political. Our state education system is the key means by which society invests in socializing our next generation. And as such, it will always be contested. But moves to ensure that it reflects evidence must surely be welcomed and encouraged. And I think that defensive reaction also fails to recognise how much high quality research impact does have an impact, including behind the scenes. For example, dampening and halting inequitable practice. I think the case of the strength of research on grammar schools and their impacts on social inequality and the nature of their cohorts is a really good exemplar here. Then we have to bear in mind the macro, meso and micro elements of policy and practice that we're wanting to influence. These elements need to be approached in different ways. Some things are easier to influence with evidence than others. An example would be that early language interventions, there are lots of examples of effective practice in this area that improve pupil progress. Whereas on a more general meta issue, such as curriculum form, that's much less straightforward. And I must say that when I'm talking, I'm making an assumption of research rigor and generalizability. Of course, small sample research has a place, especially in work elucidating theory or close to practice reflective activity. But of course, it's not appropriate to anticipate that directly impacting policymaking or directing widespread practice. So the next question is who you or your evidence is seeking to influence, knowing your audience. And one of my points of learning has been about the resonance of devices and how well these tend to go down in capturing people's imagination or memory. So at a recent talk at an EIS panel, I suggested a REST approach to increasing impact. The R stands for relationships. There are often a key set of individuals that are catalysts for research use. Networking is really fundamental, but takes time and energy. I think we often don't recognise the incredible amounts of time that people in think tanks devote to just having meetings, attending events and so forth. That ensures a shared language, influence, ideas and presenting yourself as a first port of call. And of course, language and terminology is very important. Often people use the same words, but don't mean the same thing, reflecting different organizational cultures. Then E stands for environment. And I guess here, the COVID context provides an excellent case in point. It's changed everything. But if we think more globally, teachers tend to listen to other teachers and schools to schools. In the UK context, it's not the case internationally. So again, thinking about context is very important here. The S is for solutions. we need to engage constructively rather than only critique. Policymakers and practitioners are human. None of us like to have our work critiqued, especially or critiqued without providing alternatives, especially if it's something that we've worked hard on or taken very seriously. So I think policymakers are no different. And then timeliness. Being responsive to practitioner and policy need in the ways that I've already suggested, perhaps co-creating and seeking input from research users is really important in ensuring timely, responsive research. I think the EEF has been so successful partly because it has relationships with and strategy to engage both the government and policy stakeholders on the one hand and practitioners and their organisations on the other. And this slide just quickly captures our approach with the triangle in the middle representing our threefold approach. We synthesize high quality research evidence, international research, and provide that through our toolkit, which I'll come on to next. We commission our own research, usually through experimental methods, really to fill gaps in the existing literature. And then we mobilize our evidence and engage with practitioners in different ways, including via our network of 40 research schools and their hub and spokes role in the sector. Our teaching and learning toolkit, which you saw there, is accessed by over 2/3 of school leaders to inform their decision making, takes again a very accessible approach. It captures average progress from different programs and approaches, as well as cost and the rigor of the research underpinning the meta-analysis in each case. And our toolkit is being refreshed, a huge job from Steve Higgins and the Durham team and my excellent colleagues at the EF. And that's going to be relaunched on Friday. So look out for that. And I very much welcome your feedback. We're trying to capture that rigor and nuance, but also accessibility. And there's going to be much more information, both on implementation and on different pupil subgroups that you can dig into in the new version of the toolkit. And that really brings me to the end of my talk. I think it's so important to go beyond critique in order to focus on implications for practice and to identify and test potential solutions. There are so many areas to be investigated, and it's also important to preserve and further strengthen some of the policy interventions and elements in our system that seek to improve equity and good practice. I mean, I'm thinking here very notably of the pupil premium, for example, but also now the early career framework. I'm very aware that there are academics looking at this, and I must mention Steve Gorard and his colleagues, for example, and their work on the pupil premium. But these are such areas of importance, so good examples, I think. And in conclusion, I hope to have set out the scale and importance of the challenge to narrow the socioeconomic gap for attainment so that all pupils have the same access to education for life chances. I've highlighted some of the explanations for the ongoing gap and the role of education institutions and wider society within this. I hope I've illustrated the potential we have to work together to successfully promote changes in practice, learning from the growing research evidence base about what's most effective and about effective implementation. In this way, our research can help address the urgent challenge to ensure that pupils are equally able to have the chance to thrive in education. Thank you so much for listening.
Becky, thank you so much. Really stimulating. You've covered so much ground in such illuminating ways. Some really fundamental things to do with life itself, really, isn't it? I mean, the education system you mentioned is there to socialize. And in the end, of course, we all hope that the children and young people will come out and be the best of citizens and have the best of lives for them and for society. So this is really, really important stuff. And I want to get straight into the questions, because we have quite a lot of interest here, a lot of interest. So I want to start with one question that I really felt a little bit emotional about. The person doesn't give their name, but I think you'll appreciate what I mean when I read out the question. They say, in terms of the research, in terms of the question of the importance of education research, it's hard to avoid feeling disheartened. Much of the information on inequality has been largely known for years. So is this not an argument that research has failed to really change the status quo? As an ECR, I find it hard to motivate myself when essentially my findings will be things we already know, but that haven't been properly addressed in education policy. A lot to go at that, but Becky, I wonder if you have any sort of wisdom on this, on these issues.
That's a brilliant question, and I think absolutely gets at the heart of what I've been trying to discuss in the talk today. Of course, we can't change everything and all at once. And different trends in interest by different governments and different politics and so forth also, of course, do have an impact here. Points of interest come and go. Often policymakers, I think, can also feel disheartened about lack of traction on particular issues, and then things move on. I think, gender and achievement would be a good illustrator here, where many of us are very aware that at the turn of the century, there was a huge amount of policy attention to this issue. But very little effect of different attempts to impact classroom practice, some of which were quite stereotypical and exacerbated problems. And then very little change, but the topic of debate has moved on, and policymakers have become less interested in that particular point. Nevertheless, there is so much that we can do and are doing. And I think it's really important to bear in mind both that whether we agree with the approaches or not, there are many people, stakeholders, practitioners and policymakers that are trying to make change here, and supporting them is really important. And of course, that great research really does help here. And I hope I've exemplified in my talk some of the ways that we move things on, as well as some of the very glaring questions that remain. But what I really wanted to do with the case of attainment grouping that I presented, and where, by the way, I didn't mention the amazing research of Sue Hallam and her colleagues. There are many key players and long-standing BERA members that have had an amazing impact in shaping this body of research. But despite the size of that body of research, there are key questions for classroom teachers and policymakers that we still haven't managed to answer. So being more focused, I guess I'm arguing, on practitioner needs or policymaker needs when we design our research, and think what are those outstanding questions and how can we move the debate forward, is crucial to what I'm saying. So don't give up, there's everything to play for.
Thank you, Becky, very much for that very full answer. To a rather different topic now, Richard Harrison asks the following question. I wonder how the ideas discussed might be manifested in and between arts, for example, arts, dance, drama, music, and so on, arts subjects, or whether the different spaces, physical and intellectual, in which these subjects are taught disrupt these ideas. Can students be different versions of themselves in these subjects? And are they read differently by their teachers in these subjects, which therefore may produce different outcomes? And as a musician myself, you're probably not surprised to hear me sort of zoom in on that one.
Thanks very much. In some ways, Dom, I think that you're much better placed to answer that question than me as an expert in arts education. I guess my very short answer to this would be, I think a balanced curriculum for exactly those reasons is really important. And I don't think there is anyone that argues that the arts don't continue to be important within a broad and balanced curriculum. So yeah, that's.
Yeah. Thank you, Becky. If I may just quickly respond to that by saying, actually, of course, the team led by Jake Anders at the IOE in partnership with the Behavioural Insights team, we've of course published our EEF funded work on arts-based interventions. Not an easy story to tell, but really important work, I hope. So that might be something to consider. 5 minutes to go. I've got a question that links what you said today, Becky, with what Professor Iram Siraj, one of the things she touched on, and in fact, she asked the question herself. What are the policy drivers which would encourage the best teachers to work in schools with more deprived children?
Well, this is the perennial question, isn't it? And I think many of us have been advocating policy measures that incentivize teachers to take up roles in areas of social disadvantage for many, many years. Again, I think that policymakers have sought often to try to encourage this in different ways. But often without very much traction. There are real challenges here about context, where you want to teach and where you want to live as a teacher. But I still think, and sorry, even in terms of some level of kind of financial incentive and so forth, I think policies have struggled. But there does seem to be evidence from Sam Sims and colleagues that actually, in terms of financial incentivization can work. It just has to be sufficiently significant. So that's one way of going at it. And I also think that we can do more, perhaps in relation to career progress, and being able to develop schemes, government schemes that flag teaching in socially disadvantaged areas as a sort of point, almost a career badge. It's certainly the case that in jurisdictions like Shanghai, where local government is able to actually move head teachers around the system, you can certainly have far quicker impact than in a more democratic system where teachers can choose where to work. But nevertheless, I think that there's more that we can do here.
Thank you, Becky. And I think just one final question, which I think in one way is a kind of methodological challenge to us all, as well as a very important issue live in society. And this is EJ Francis Caris-Hamer, who says, why does research when referring to gender really mean, quote, sex? And where's the data on attainment gap and queer identities? I understand that class, ethnicity and sex is important, but for the queer community, visibility is important.
That's a great question. And I'm afraid I haven't engaged in this area of gender and attainment for a while. I imagine that some of those issues are relatively hard to capture or analyse based on the sort of, a lot of this, the prior work is based on DFE data. And I don't know, I'm not familiar with it capturing nuance on sexuality and identity in that way. But certainly the very fact that I can't straightforwardly answer your question suggests that more could be done there. And real questions, I think, about the points at which identities do or don't make positive or negative impacts on attainment. We've still got much more to learn there.
Yeah, I agree. Just a personal anecdote, talking to colleagues working on cohort studies, new cohort studies, the challenge of balancing how people want to define their own identities versus the real importance, for example, in health outcomes of attributing biological characteristics. And that whole area of debate is perhaps the contemporary debate of the moment. So great question. Becky, thank you ever so much. It was lovely to hear you talk. Superb questions from the audience. Thank you, everyone. Sorry, as ever, I couldn't get through them all. But BERA will be, giving information about how to access all of these recordings in due course, once we've had time to sort of think through how that can be done most helpfully for you all. So Becky, wonderful. Thank you ever so much. And that is the end of today's keynote.
Thanks so much. Great to have the chance. See you.